Welcome to Ian Dale All Talk. Please give a warm welcome to your presenter, Ian Dale.
Hello and a very good afternoon. Welcome to the show. It's the 10th. It's a penultimate one. I feel as if I'm sort of gliding into the runway now. Wish I was here actually for the whole month, but maybe that would be a little bit too much. Tomorrow we have Jess Phillips as our final guest on Ian Dale All Talk. Hope one or two of you may come along to that. But without further ado, let's get on to the main business of the day and introduce the YouTube sensation that is David Starkey.
I can't shake a crutch, can I?
I never thought you would become a YouTuber.
Nor did I. It's called The Fruits of Cancellation. Yes.
We might come on to that. Tell us a bit more about it. I don't know how many people in the audience are subscribers, watch your YouTube videos, but every time I've watched one, I've thought, I mean, they're varying length, but I've always watched it to the end. And that's the thing often on social media or YouTube. We all have the attention span of a flea, so we watch 3 minutes and then move on to something else. But you've got stickability, if I may say so.
It sounds like an advertisement for sellotape, but I suppose, you know, for most of my professional career, I was actually a teacher.
Yeah.
And you develop the art of, if you're any good at it, you develop the art of lecturing. Which there's a wonderful description of lecturing by somebody that we don't normally think of as a great comic. That's the philosopher Bertrand Russell. And it's one of the most genuine funny lines, which is he'd been on a lecture series in America, which he'd absolutely hated doing. He came back and he said, lecturing, the art of lecturing is casting synthetic pearls, ladies and gentlemen, before real swine.
Well, how to get an audience on side right from the start.
How to get the audience on your side. I don't see it like that. I think that, again, let me be equally naughty. I once made a terrible mistake of describing how I saw oral performance at a school speech day when I hadn't realised, A, there were people under the age of 11 there, and B, there was a mother superior. And I described it as a form of oral sex. And
okay.
What you're doing is you're taking an audience, you're involving them, you're carrying them with you, you're teasing them, you're holding them back, you're bringing them forward. It's genuine performance. It's why most university teachers are so bad at what they do. They're just scholars. You have to have that. There's to be a smack of the grease paint about it. The other thing is I'm now being dismissive and talking about it simply as technique. The very simple answer is you've got to have something to say. And what is striking about most people, and certainly most people in social media, they don't actually have anything to say. There's no idea, there's no shape, there's no purpose. And that, of course, applies in spades to virtually the whole of our political class. You just have a sense of vapidity.
That was going to be my next question, because when you were talking there, I was thinking, yeah, there were quite a few politicians that... I interviewed Keir Starmer yesterday, and...
I'm sure he was riveting. Yes.
Well, he was in some ways, but not in others. And I was, all the time when he was talking, thinking... Tony Blair wouldn't have said that. Tony Blair would have put it differently. And Tony Blair, whatever your politics
Who are you being rude about?
I suppose it depends on your perspective, doesn't it?
It
but
does.
I think if you're going to be a successful politician in the 21st century, you've got to have it. We all know what it is. We can't define it, but we know who's got it and we know who hasn't. Ian Duncan Smith didn't have it. He wouldn't turn heads when he walked into the room. Tony Blair would. And
Bill Clinton.
Bill Clinton, the ultimate charisma politician. But there is, of course, a school of thought that says, well, once you've had a charismatic politician, the electorate often likes a boring one. I mean, I don't know if going through history whether you think that there's any...
There's a better way of putting it, actually, which is, of course, which is the difference. Our politicians fall into two groups. They're either bookies or bishops. And, of course, Boris is the archetypical cheating bookie, and Keir Starmer is in fact, he's worse than a bishop. He's a moderator of the Church of Scotland. You know, that kind of infinite, oozing self-righteous. But I think, again, the ancient view of politics was that it's essentially rhetoric. It's persuasive speech. In other words, going right back to your first question. And the art of politics is the art of persuasion. It is persuading people to do things without the use of force. It's to make them do what they don't want to do because they feel they ought to, because they're picked up, they're taken with them. You're persuaded. And very few of our politicians, in fact, very few people. So we've got something that, of course, is a kind of trick form of persuasion, which is most kind of advertising, which appeals merely, which titillates, whatever. There's another kind of persuasion, which I think at the moment we desperately need, which is the persuasion of the mind, what we were talking about at the beginning. And we're going to face very, very tough times. We are riding now, we're in the very first steps of a road to Weimar. We've built in the absolute inevitability of inflation and probably superinflation. And we've done it over 20 years. We've replicated every single mistake of the 40s, 50s and 60s, and we've done it with extra zeros. People are going to have to be told this. No politician dares to, will do. The problem is everybody of every side, in every country of the West, is complicit.
That's incredibly depressing.
But it's true. I mean, again, one of the terrible problems of the age that we live in is the refusal to confront the truth. The whole world of so much of the social media, the whole world of critical race theory, the whole world of transsexuality is a gigantic lie. It's an act of faith. It's preposterous. The idea that a man can become a woman. These are absurd. They're simple absurdities. And that large parts of the population, the young population, those who one would hope were most questing, were most disillusioned with fiction, swallow fiction. And sorry, we really are. We don't need a new Jesus Christ. We need a teller of blunt, cruel truths. Well, perhaps that was Jesus. In other words, if you actually read much of the Bible is brutal. Let me give you a particularly good example that's always also used by Lenin, of course, who was about to train to be a priest. He who will not work, neither shall he eat. Tell that to people who've got to enjoy furlough and not working from home.
But instead of Jesus Christ, we're getting Liz Truss.
We're getting Liz Truss. What I've never understood, Ian, why hasn't been more made of her surname? Do you know what it is? It's a support for when you've got a hernia. And that's what a truss means. Isn't there a sense that she's the last gesture of the Tory party, limping with this gigantic protuberance, and it's fitted with a truss? God help it. God help us.
I'm told in Greek it means something akin to shit.
Maybe, well, I think
Greek.
I can now say I'm a mere grammar school boy, so I didn't do Greek. I'm very sorry, I can't help you.
But what we're going to have to get used to, if you're right, is, from my teenage years, I've always grown up thinking that the world will become a better place, either economically or in whatever sphere, as time goes on. But a new generation of teenagers, what you're saying is they're going to have to get used to the opposite.
I think what we've done, we've lived through an extraordinary period. I was born in 45. We've lived through a period. Let me just give you a very simple illustration of an absolute basic fact. When I was a little boy, I was bought as my first real present. Parents, skilled worker, but modest wage in the far north of England, council house and whatever. My father was earning about £5 a week. I was bought a tricycle, a second-hand tricycle. Would you care to guess how much a second-hand tricycle cost in 1948?
5 shillings.
£6, 13 shillings
Really?
and 4pence. We have got used to this absolute collapse in the prices of manufactured goods. Labour costs have gone up, which is why we all feel better off. But there's been this huge collapse in the price of manufactured goods. There's been another great collapse in prices, which is food. Again, I remember, because In the 60s, I was really becoming very aware of all sorts of things. I spent quite some time in France. I became an avid reader of Paris Match. And there was a report of the wedding.
It's a bit trashy for you, isn't it?
I have a trashy side, you know. If you'd been better looking, you'd have probably found it out. But there we are. But anyway, on my trashy side, I was reading it, and it was really trashy. It was an account of the wedding of Jackie Onassis, Jackie Kennedy to Onassis, the Greek ship magnate, and there was a description of this fantastically elaborate, extravagant wedding breakfast. And do you know what the main course was? Chicken stuffed with peaches. Sounds utterly disgusting. Chicken was an exotic food. It was incredibly expensive. We are going to see, I mean, look at what's happening with grain prices and whatever. We are going to see the reversal of this great fall in prices. The great fall in prices brought about partly by China and the transfer of manufacturing to the Far East. The great fall of food prices brought about partly by technology, partly by factory farming, partly by antibiotics, all of these things. This is going to go into reverse gear. Inevitably. We were talking before we came up here about cycles. We've again built ourselves into this utter myth that there's a thing called permanent progress, or to expect that everything gets better all of the time. I mean, it's perfectly clear that in all sorts of ways and in all sorts of fields, there's been no progress at all. It seems to me that it's manifest in the arts that things have gone backwards since the beginning of the 20th century. Remember, modern art didn't begin as art. It began as a program to destroy art. If you look at the surrealists, they call themselves anartists, as in anarchists. Their intention is actually to destroy art, to use Rembrandt's as ironing boards. It seems to me they've succeeded admirably. If you look at the collapse of a musical tradition, the tradition of classical music, if you look at our productivity, we're wonderful at performance. I imagine there's the best theatre, there's the best performed opera, but in terms of creativity, it shifted to other things. It shifted to technology, and so on. Architecture, okay. I mean, have you ever, I don't know how many of you have just walked around here, have you looked at the indescribable ugliness, I'm now going to sound like Prince Charles, of the modern buildings around here, and contrasted them with that decent regularity of the Georgian of the early 19th century? The hotel we are staying in, if you go into the rooms, the furniture
don't slag it off, they might have been giving us cheap rates.
The furniture looks like coprolites. Do we all know what a coprolite is? It's fossilized shit. And it's indescribably
I quite like
ugly.
it.
Yeah, well, there we are. You're wearing that coloured suit.
I'm not
We're
sure.
doing Punch and Judy.
We
I'm
are.
sorry.
I'm not sure
sorry.
I agree with you. You look at music, for example. I mean, yes, classical music isn't the dominant genre now anymore, but you look at all the different types of music that have developed since the beginning of the 20th century, and I don't think you could really argue that the quality, the variety of music has diminished at all. In fact, I think quite the reverse.
Well, it depends. You like what you like.
I mean,
I do think that the notion that Bob Dylan is as good as Mozart is simply silly.
Oh, I agree with that.
Well, really,
Bjorn Ulvaeus and Benny Andersson, on the other hand.
these are names.
ABBA.
I think I rest my case. But this is a dispute about taste. And it does seem to me that all I was trying to say is that progress is not an even thing. In the same way that there have been astonishing shifts, both for better and for worse, in things like the popular attitudes to education. If I look back at my father's generation, that passion of so many of the working class for self-improvement, through trade unions, through activities within churches, through reading classes and whatever. You could say, okay, it's because they didn't have television, they didn't have anything else to do. There's an element of truth, but that passion for self-improvement, that's been lost. That, again, I fear we're going to have to start to rediscover it. Now, we've got used to the notion that the state provides, that there is a virtual universe. It may not work very well, and clearly with the NHS it works very badly, but we've got used to a universalism of welfare. We are going to have to start to choose. I mean, we've already got the state consuming roughly 40% of GDP. Now, that is the highest, tax and whatever, these are the highest levels since the Second World War. And again, it's something we do need, and no politician will say this because we're all in it together. Our gross overreaction to COVID has left us with the equivalent of a post-war situation. The lockdown was the disturbed civil society, disturbed the economy on the same scale as the Second World War.
I was thinking the other day about inflation and the cost of living crisis, which I don't think anybody could argue that we haven't got one, and you're saying essentially it's going to get a lot worse. But my first political awakenings, I suppose, were in the second half of the 1970s. And I can remember thinking as a sort of 15, 16-year-old, there must be a different way. I mean, Britain was beset by strikes, had high inflation, unemployment was starting to rise, and we were a laughingstock as a country. And you think, well, were there demands in the late 1970s for the government to introduce radical bailout measures for people who couldn't afford to feed themselves or clothe their families or provide a house for their family? And I don't remember there being that clamour that we've got now where something must be done, it's the government that must do it. And any politician, regardless of whether they're left and right, woe betide them if they come out with any other argument than, yes, of course, we must do more.
Absolutely. And the person who is centrally to blame is Gordon Brown. That it is Gordon Brown who introduced it.
It's a very unpopular thing to say in these parts.
This is really important that we grasp how fundamental his responsibility for the crisis is. He's responsible for the first wave of quantitative easing following the financial crisis of 2008. That undoes everything that Thatcher did. That is the moment at which you build the inevitability of inflation into the national system. And of course it was disguised because the money went to banks, which meant that it only inflated assets. But if you go back to the 1970s, I'm that bit older than you, I can remember the actual process that had happened. It begins with the great property inflation of 1972 to 1973, which is a compressed version of what we've had with property price and asset price inflation since 2008. In 1972, following the Barber boom, property prices multiplied, 3 times in 1 year. Then you had the Middle East war and the vast spike of petrol prices, and that was the world. Why there wasn't, however, that clamour for the state to do something was Gordon Brown introduces the idea that to make welfare acceptable, even the prosperous have to be given welfare. So you introduced the extraordinary levels of child benefit. You introduce freebies to all people like me, wealthy old age pensioners, whatever number of £100 a year it is, fuel allowances and so on. You build in this absolute assumption that there's this kind of churn from taxation into welfare, and somehow it can be done without any cost. And then just to make sure the blame is shared, of course, the most catastrophic example of this is Sunak. Sunak really is Brown Mark II, and the whole process of paying for the catastrophe of lockdown, the whole business of furlough and whatever, is the ultimate extension of that. So you now get Ed Davey calling for, a little furlough to deal with the inflation of fuel. Not inflation, the increased price of fuel. And do you know he produces, Davey, who must be, I think, we were talking about competitions for really bad politicians. He scores very, very highly on the bad scale. Said, it will only cost 1/10 as much as furlough, mere 30 billion. Ladies, do you remember a famous, rather good politician called Reagan who said, you know, a billion here, a billion there, you're soon talking real money?
You're a very shy and retiring type. Let's talk about you. On Tuesday...
I'm shy, Mary Ellen, I'm shy. Yes.
On Tuesday, Mary Beard was here.
Uh-huh.
And at the end of the show, I announced who was coming up, and I mentioned your name, and there was a little bit of a hiss in the audience. How do you think that you are seen by people nowadays?
I think I divide people's opinions.
Do you deliberately seek to?
No, there was a time when I did. There was a time, clearly, when I was doing things like The Moral Maze, that one took a pleasure simply in tweaking tales. I think I've got a bit older, a bit more serious, and I've got more worried about things. I suppose now, if I see myself at all, and continuing from the lines of Mary Beard, except, of course, she's a Roman classicist, not a Greek one, I see myself as a bit of a Cassandra. And the truth is never a very pleasant thing. When I was a schoolboy, I was a rather good actor. I did, not being a shy and retiring kind, my great triumph was playing Beckett in T.S. Eliot's Murder in the Cathedral. And I think it's in that play, but anyway, it's a T.S. Eliot line, mankind cannot bear too much reality. And the problem with democratic politics is that it's a game of pretending that reality doesn't exist. That you can have, as we pretended for ever since Blair, that you can have a low-tax economy and a fully functioning welfare state. You can't. It's the notion, as Boris Johnson is deeply fond of cakeism, that you can have your cake and eat it. As Boris has just discovered, you can't. Now, these are not nice things. People don't like being told them. Or some people might.
But do you revel in being seen as so controversial? Or do you sometimes wish that you could become one of these sort of national treasure types? Maybe you are.
No, because do I want to be Stephen Fry? No. I really don't. I mean, most of them are the equivalent of national dummies. You shove it in the mouth of baby with a dab of sugar. No. They're for children.
You mentioned earlier being cancelled. Tell us about that in your own words, because it was obviously a controversial incident, but you have come back from that, which many people don't.
Yes, I mean, I did something stupid. I said something stupid, as you quite bluntly said, and we will rehearse the exact words.
Let's not.
In front of a paying audience, as it were. I said something profoundly stupid because I was carried away by feeling. I thought that, and I still think, that again, we were talking about absurd reactions. My view is that our reaction to COVID, which on the scale of pestilence is just about down there. The Black Death is a real pestilence, wipes out 50% of the population cumulatively. COVID doesn't even touch a fraction of 1%, and yet we inflict the same kind of economic consequences on ourselves. Well, I think that the whole Black Lives Matter response in Britain to George Floyd's death was equally silly. Our police don't kill people, they don't hardly arrest anybody, let alone go. Do they? Do they? Of course they don't. It was one of these extraordinary examples that a significant part of the population of Britain imagines they live in America. We pay a completely excessive, and I've lived in America, I've had an American house, that we pay a completely excessive regard. You had all these people in British politics when the Supreme Court ruled that there was no such thing as a right to abortion. And all these people saying, we've got to insert a right to abortion in the British Bill of Rights. Whereas, of course, we do things differently and, in my view, much more sensibly here. So it was one of those moments, the whole that crisis of Of course, at the height of the problems with COVID and whatever, the whole response to Floyd's death was one of those things that is wonderfully described by Lord Macaulay as the British public in one of its ridiculous fits of morality. Nothing as ridiculous as the British public in one of its periodic fits of morality. And I felt very strongly about it because, of course, Black Lives Matter and that whole peculiar twisting of racial consciousness that involves is deliberately intended to destroy civilization. We must understand that. That's its explicit aim and its explicit purpose. And it does it by targeting my subject.
They talk about destroying capitalism.
No. It actually talks about this. Well, it's the same thing. Other people have just jumped. Anglo-America invents the modern world. Modernity is invented here and in the United States, and especially here in Scotland in the 17th, well, not in Scotland, it takes you a bit of time to catch up, but it's true, the only reason you get a Scottish Enlightenment is union with England. It would not have happened. It is union that provides that astonishing explosion. Anyway, just going back to it. But that is the aim of Black Lives Matter. The ideological aim. That and the way of doing it and why I felt about it so strongly, it is to use a targeted attack on British history. And remember, Scotland is fully involved in empire. Really important. And Scotland well understands this. This kind of myth that Scotland was colonised by England. Absolutely not. Scotland came voluntarily and passionately on the part of its governing class into union at the beginning of the 18th century to participate in the English empire. And by God did Scotland participate. And the idea of Black Lives Matter is to delegitimate British history. And you do it by claiming that it is that all its talk about freedom, its talk about civilization and culture is fundamentally flawed by the fact that it involved slavery. In other words, what you're trying to do is to use the empire and slavery to delegitimate British history in the same way that Nazism delegitimated German history. That's the nature of the game. And the best way that it's done is by claiming that slavery is genocide. And I pointed out that it isn't genocide. You can tell very simply it's not genocide if you just look at numbers, and this is where the terrible remark came in, that if you look at the number of slaves who are actually exported to the 13 American colonies, it is a tiny figure. It's about 300,000. It multiplies 3 times. And it was a stupid thing to say, and it was tired, it was the end of a day. I was dealing with a fawning interlocutor with Darren Grimes. But it was deliberately, of course, torn from my mouth. It was deliberately blown up. And here again, I think we do need to understand this process of cancellation. There are 2 elements to making a remark like that. One is the folly of making it, and the fact that I very quickly apologised, and did so.
It wasn't that quick.
2 days, and I was doing for the rest.
But that's what I mean. In today's social media world, 2 days is a lifetime.
But sorry, do you know what I was doing in those 2 days?
No.
Having every single academic honour and distinction that I'd ever earned stripped from me for something that is entirely extraneous. Can you imagine what it's like to go through that? Can you imagine what it's like that organisations, and I'll name them, like my own college at Cambridge, headed by Sally Morgan. Can you imagine an organisation like the Mary Rose, headed by Alan Lovell, that you've devoted 25 years to, in the case of my college, pushing 60? At a moment, at a twinkling of an eye, with an error of 1 word, they junk you. Can you imagine what it's like going through that? Do you think that it might take a little time?
I do.
To get round?
No, I can completely understand that.
But anyway, so can I just finish? You asked me a question, and I'm trying to give you a very honest and straightforward answer. You make the mistake. I didn't say I misspoke. I didn't haver. I said it was wrong. But what then happens, of course, is that the social media then clip, and they deliberately deploy and create a Twitter storm. Now, some very interesting work has been done on this by a man called Jonathan Haidt, published in that splendid periodical, The Atlantic. And he demonstrates that the way a Twitter storm works is deliberately calculated to arouse a wave of offence and outrage. In other words, I made an error on a tiny minor podcast. The reason that it's orchestrated, the reason that it's amplified in this extraordinary way is a deliberate calculation, and I actually know who started it. Somebody of the far left, who is at the moment saying, isn't it disgraceful that we're intervening in the Ukraine, and isn't the ex-Soviet Union wonderful? Those are the kind of people, I'm afraid. So, how did I survive? Because I'm tough, and also, Ian, because I got friends like you. You were one of the first to say, you've gone through enough. Come on the show. And I'm very grateful.
That didn't quite work out as I'd intended at any rate, did it?
What do you mean? It did, I think, on the first show that we did. Afterwards.
I seem to remember a rather horrible spat between you and Paul Mason.
Oh, yeah, but actually, you see, it's been very interesting. One survived that too. And this, I don't know whether the name Paul Mason means anything, an absolute far lefty. I was saying...
You spent the first half of the programme, yes, I agree with you, Paul. Yes, David, you're absolutely right on that. And then it went wrong.
Well, let me try and... Again, it's a really interesting point, and it's a very important point.
This was on my cross-question.
I was arguing that the idea of international law is preposterous, because there's no such thing as international law, because the law needs an agency, a monopoly of force to enforce it. So you could only have international law if you had an international government. And at which point Mason says, oh, you sound like a Nazi talking about force. Now, suddenly, Mason has had an epiphany. He finds himself on the right side over the Ukraine. He has suddenly discovered, as I pointed out to him, that right needs might. And all tribute to him. I don't think he'll call me a Nazi again.
Wouldn't bet on
well, okay, right. If he's consistent, now that may be flattering him too much. I don't think he's a fool. And I think, dare I say it, that the savagery of his dispute with the far left on this, I think, has reminded him of some very serious truth. In other words, he's learning truth. It seems to me, again, that all this stuff about, can you imagine anything sillier? This, again, is Liz Truss, right at the beginning of the Ukraine war. We're gathering evidence to use to put Putin on trial for war crimes. Can you imagine anything more absurdly preposterous and deluded? It's utterly silly. First, defeat Russia, a nuclear power. When Churchill decides that Germany is that the only terms that Britain will accept is defeat or unconditional surrender, then you can have Nuremberg. Then you can talk about holding to account. You can't otherwise when you're fighting a proxy war. The problem, of course, is that West thought that Russia was another Serbia and Kosovo. It flexed. Can you imagine the mighty muscles of the West? We were talking about Clinton. The mighty muscles of the West flexed against Serbia. We triumphed. We enforced the international rule of law. It took NATO 24 days of bombing, I seem to remember, to do it. And we sell ourselves myths. Most of the world is not on our side against Russia. India isn't. Argentina isn't. South Africa isn't. Indonesia isn't. Only, I think, about 8 members of the G20 are. And we all the time, we sell ourselves myths. We spend our time sucking boiled sweets.
You weren't just cancelled by academic institutions. You were cancelled by the entire media. And I can't remember how long it was after the incident that I invited you back, but I knew that I couldn't invite you onto my show for at least a length of time.
And you had a bit of a struggle even when you did it.
I had a few people saying, are you sure this is such a good idea? And I had to be fairly trenchant on that. And you have now, well, you're now working for GB News, aren't you?
And of course, let's again be really clear. There were organisations that didn't drop me. The Critic, which seems to me now to knock the Spectator into a cocked hat. The Spectator is simply elegant essay making. The Critic has a few ideas in it. That didn't. So there were people of real courage, and there were those of slightly latter-day courage, and Ian Collins, again, at roughly the same time on Talk Radio. Because again, you see, what seems to me to be the extraordinary business of the attempt at cancellation, it's like going back to the Middle Ages. My friend, who is Dan Jones, the wonderful medieval historian, whom I taught at Cambridge all those years ago, he described what people are trying to do to you now as the equivalent of an act of attainder. You know, and cancellation is a mixture of burning at the stake, and I think there's no doubt whatever that if those people had been able to burn me at the stake, they would, as a heretic, combined with the secular penalty of confiscation, the literal stripping of everything, the condemning of you to a kind of social exile. Again, I was very fortunate. Not a single friend betrayed me. Not one. The only person who did was the kind of person, I'll give you an idea of what he was like. I was about to be invited to an immensely extravagant house party in Italy. And I received a note the day.
Lebedev.
Literally, that I was going to leave, I think about 36 hours after the cancellation. I'll give you an idea of the kind of person he was. He buys friends and he buys a garden. One of my favourite memories of him was going to his house in Blackheath, and this garden was a magnificent sea of foxgloves. I said, it looks absolutely wonderful. He said, yes, I had 10,000 planted last night. Buy friends, buy your garden.
I keep thinking of Michael Heseltine. I don't know why, but I know.
It was furniture. It was furniture.
Furniture.
And I think his morals were roughly similar. Yes, right.
So, do you know, it's incredible. We've done 40 minutes and we haven't mentioned the Tudors, but I think there's a few questions in here on those. I do want to talk about sort of history in general and your love of it and teaching, but there may be a few questions.
Well, at least I
that.
must be the first martyr to history, as I was explaining. Yes.
Yeah, quite. Ben, who's a history teacher, says, how far does Dr. Starkey agree that Queen Anne is underestimated by male historians because her virtues are womanly and she is, in fact, England's greatest queen?
Well, certainly England enjoys its greatest triumphs under Queen Anne. I'm not sure I think she had very much to do with them. Do we all realise this? It's the reign in which you get this astonishing reversal of England, well, Britain it becomes, because of course the Act of Union takes place, and it's said that the bells of St Paul's are never silent. You're ringing for the great victories of Marlborough's triumph over the French, and then you're ringing above all for the Act of Union in 1707, which Anne regards as her greatest, the greatest triumph of a reign of triumphs. And it is this astonishing reversal of the position of England/Britain that takes place at the end of the 17th century. In 1688, under James II, England is effectively a French satellite, a dependency. Within 12 years, you have Marlborough, and you have the defeat of Blenheim, and you have the shattering of the French hegemony over Europe, which never is fully restored. And it's fascinating. I'm not only interested in the Tudors, I think my best television series was on Churchill, on the two Churchills, on the great John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, and on his descendant, Winston. And what you can see is Winston, in the period of his exile, again, he was exiled from he was exiled from office and whatever for the whole period before the Second World War. He uses that period of exile to study essentially the reign of Queen Anne. He studies his great ancestor, Marlborough, and do you know what? He really learns how to fight a war. I think one of the reasons that he jumps into the role of war commander is because he'd studied Marlborough in such detail. He'd also studied his opponent. He'd also studied with Louis XIV. And so many of the things that he says about Hitler, he also says about Louis XIV. This absolutism, this instinct for hegemony, for domination abroad, but also the persecution of a minority at home, the Huguenots. You see, again, I think this is something that I believe passionately. I don't believe you simply learn lessons from history. But it does seem to me that the proper training for a politician is history. It really is. And if you look at the very greatest, like Churchill or Winston, or the great politicians of the 19th century, in my view, supremely Disraeli, if we're looking on the right, they're soaked in history. It is how you understand human behaviour. It's a kind of concentrated, a distillation, a kind of whiskey of experience. It's all been concentrated down. But it has to be a proper study. You have to have an awareness of this resonance across time. You have the notion that, which has become very fashionable, that, history must be sealed off and cut off. No, you should constantly be getting people to think across time, to think of parallels, similarities, contrasts, differences.
Well, I'm going to ask you to do that now. Jeff has got a slightly provocative question here.
No.
He says, do you find any part of Scottish history remotely interesting or significant?
I think the Act of Union with England was supremely important. And I'm being deadly serious. And it's also really important that we understand what happened in 1707. What happened in 1707 is one of the most astonishing examples of the creation of a state ever. Scotland joins with England on strict conditions. It preserves everything separate apart from its parliament and its army and its finances. It preserves its own entire structure, religious structure, its church, its educational structure, its structure of heraldry, everything, the whole texture of civil society. The Queen, as we all know, changes religion when she actually crosses the frontier. Its system of law and all the peculiar texture of Scottish society is preserved, which is why, of course, Britain has never been a nation. This is something we really must understand. Britain has never been a nation. It is an uneasy fusion. It's really a mini empire in itself. Britain is an empire in itself, and that is because of the terms of union with Scotland. And do you know what? I think this has turned out to be an extraordinarily good thing. If you have a nation state like France that acquires the passionate identities, that endeavours to impose uniformity through education, it's very, very difficult to accommodate immigrants. One of the reasons that Britain has been so good at accommodating immigrants is we were already a multinational society. The first internationals are between England and Scotland at soccer in the late 19th century. So it's an empire, it's not a nation, which again, going back to that worst politician of modern times, Gordon Brown, the desperate attempt at inventing Britain as a nation in the latter days of New Labour was a catastrophe. And of course, devolution is an absolute catastrophe because the only point of union between England and Scotland was political. It was the union of parliaments. This is why devolution is so utterly devastatingly destructive. And again, Britain is profoundly unsuitable to have a federal state structure because you have this overwhelmingly large unit of England and the fringe Celtic nations. The way it worked under the old British Empire was that you had two completely different kinds of nationhood. The Celtic nations were typical European nationalisms. So you had national music, the bagpipes, national dress, the absurdity of the kilt and whatever, national poet, the awful Burns. England.
Hang on. I'm a descendant of him.
Come on.
Mind you, half of Scotland is, I imagine.
Can't we tease each other, for heaven's sake? Whereas England was a great nation nationalism. Have you noticed there's no such thing as English national dress? There's no English...
Morris dancing.
But that's simply absurd. I mean, nobody thinks it's representative. In fact, English national dress is what I'm wearing. It's a well-cut suit. I mean, it's actually invented as
You hide
opposed
it well.
as opposed to the French habillé and all the silk and whatever. But England was England, in other words, was the political identity and supplied the political institutions. Remember, the British Parliament is just the English Parliament. The British monarchy is just the English monarchy. The Scottish monarchy was frozen, hence the regalia being forgotten in Edinburgh Castle until they're romantically rediscovered by Walter Scott. So yes, I'm rather interested in Scottish history, but they're two different ones. When Simon Sharma tried to do a history of Britain, it didn't work because there isn't such a thing. There really isn't. England and Scotland have radically different histories. They exist in this extraordinary, uneasy relationship with each other. And the creation of the British Empire of 1707 gave them their best shot at accommodation, which again, with the random shifts and the absolutely disastrous constitutional changes of New Labour, has been totally destabilised.
Now, you have an opportunity to commit news with your answer to this question, but
I thought I'd done quite well so far.
just bear in mind your previous experience is all I would advise. An American historian thinks that Elizabeth I could have been non-binary. What's your view?
Oh, how very silly! I can give you an absolutely precise factual answer. Elizabeth is twice examined gynecologically by her doctors, and they come to the conclusion that she's able to bear children. So unless we're dealing with that kind of binary, there's no doubt what she is. Of course, she's a woman. She has passionate love affairs. She would have loved to have been able to marry Robert Dudley. She simply can't. There's a marvellous phrase, I'm condensing it, by the cleverest politician who's not allowed to hold office under her, William Paget. And what he says is this: anybody that she could marry, she wouldn't. That's because they're not good looking enough. In other words, anybody of the right social status. And if you look, for example, at a portrait of the first foreign sovereign that's proposed for her, Eric of Sweden, you see why she wouldn't want to marry him very clearly. And then anybody that she would marry, she couldn't because they're of the wrong social status, like Dudley. She wants children. She's impaled on the horns of a dilemma. And the really important thing to understand about her, and maybe this will give you the little news item, she's famously known as the Virgin Queen. All I can say again is she's a born-again virgin. She discovers virginity. The line that she's virgin it becomes very prominent from really only from the early 1580s.
No, so you don't think she was?
Clever girlfriends of mine tell me this is a matter that can be dealt with, but I certainly think that the relation. I'm mindful of your advice. The passion of the relationship with Dudley, no one can know how far it went. She would have, I think, never ever have risked full sex, but But what I'm trying to say is the idea of her virginity is one that's pushed only once the idea of marriage has been finally abandoned, which takes 20-odd years.
This is a brilliant question. What was the most important year and why? Ever.
Oh.
Ever.
God.
Just giving you time to think.
Do you know what? I'm genuinely stumped. I don't think there's...
Well, whoever asked that question, bloody well done.
Okay, the year of Isaac Newton's birth, which I don't know. Let's see, I'm a great believer in admitting ignorance. When you're ignorant, don't bluff.
Shall I Google it?
Newton, you may look it up. Newton and Locke between them in England in the end of the 17th century invent modernity. I don't know about you, I quite like modernity. The trouble is, at the moment, we seem to me to be throwing it away. We've lost confidence in it. We've lost confidence in their achievements.
1643.
There we are. That's the most important year. What he did, the reconstruction of the view of the world, the realization, finally, that the world is determined, and I'm hopeless at maths unless there is a pound or dollar sign in front, at which point I become quite good. But Newton's effective discovery that the world is determined by mathematics is what creates modernity. And we are the children of Newton. And it's a Frenchman who really recognises this. It's Voltaire, one of the very few Frenchmen to have lived in England at that time, to have learned to speak English and to appreciate the country, recognises that there is this moment. We were talking about change. That's when the real change, everything that we've been talking about, just piggybacks off that. But, you know, it's what many 400 years ago. We are almost 400 years ago. It may be that those changes are being played out. It may be that extraordinary spurt of creativity on these tiny islands is exhausted. It would actually be very surprising if that weren't true. So again, thank you. It's always good to have to be made to think.
Isn't it?
Thank you.
Right, with your reluctance to admit you ever get things wrong, could you have been a politician? Brackets, Starkey for PM.
I hope I've illustrated that I do admit I get things wrong. I think there's nothing worse than pretending knowledge. I do know quite a lot, but I hope I know the limits of my knowledge. Could I have been a politician? No. Until very recently, I couldn't control my temper. I'm too arrogant.
What changed that?
Several things, including deaths. More self-awareness. Cancellation was quite good for me. Being serious. I'd had a career in which, like Boris, I'd always been able to get away with it. And it's quite good not to get away with something. You know, I was also brought up with an extraordinary mother who didn't believe in corporal punishment. And maybe the odd clip. And cancellation is a very sharp clip. So again, going back to the business of politician, I think I'm not sociable enough. And do you know what is the real reason I could never be a politician? I can't remember names. And if you look at a typical politician, they may know absolutely nothing about anything, but by God will they remember your name. And you watch a Blair or particularly a Clinton working a room. They have this staggering capacity.
Clinton was brilliant at that, and he wouldn't just remember your name, he'd remember your children's name and sort of, oh, how's your mother and all the rest of it. I mean, that is, it's part of the armoury of a politician, though, isn't it, actually?
It is. It is.
Right. This is another question. Can I invite you to say something about Scottish nationalism? Does it say something nice or something not nice?
A country has got the right to determine its own future. I think that one of the things that's most striking is that at the moment you have, if you look, we've got two countries in Europe that are undergoing major secessionist movements. One is in Spain with Catalonia, the other is with Scotland in Britain. Have you noticed that the English don't greatly care? Whereas in Spain, all sorts of things, including quasi-treason trials, politicians arrested and whatever. England's view of Scotland is, I think, rather like the rest of the empire. It's what I'm trying to say. We should best understand Britain as an empire, as an imperial construct itself. The British, unlike the French, didn't weep huge tears over the loss of empire. There was a certain shrugging of the shoulders. And indeed, there was something else. And I think it's the most important thing I could say. The great history of the British Empire was that after the terrible rupture of the loss of the American colonies, the astonishing thing that the British Empire did was to will its own end. Beginning with the Durham Report in Canada, the British Empire decides that the dominions, essentially, of course, the white dominions, will become self-governing and will eventually become independent. And you deliberately, within the empire, create the machinery of self-government, of parliaments, of prime ministers, of governors general and all the rest of it. And they are given full recognition by the Statute of Westminster of 1931 and so on. It's an extraordinary achievement. And it could be that Scottish independence will be another stage in that process. One can only hope that it's done amicably and that it's done responsibly. At the moment, my sense is that it's very different. And again, I speak as an outsider, as somebody who's not spent much time in Scotland. I get the sense that it is profoundly divisive, that it is splitting Scotland down the middle. The opinion polls suggest it's very much like Brexit in England, that you get 51-41. It's that kind of line of divide. And also, there should be no pretense that it will be easy, that Australia, Canada, New Zealand found the process quite difficult, but of course they're remote, they're separate. They had their own, and developed very quickly, their own distinct economies. England and Scotland don't have distinct economies. On the contrary, they're intermeshed with the result of now 300 years of being together. It will be, if it happens, my fear is that it will be like separating Siamese twins joined at the head, and it'll be a piece of equally difficult political surgery.
Final question, because we've come to the end of our time. I get the impression that the state of history has never been better in a way, and that I think more history books are being sold. There are more historical documentaries on TV of varying quality, it has to be said, I think. Are you optimistic about the study of history in the future?
No, because one of the things that's happened, I think, in many ways, the best history has moved outside the universities. That the extraordinary people like, let's plug names, Andrew Roberts, Dan Jones, they've never held a university post. And yet they're brilliant historians, brilliant biographers, wonderful communicators. Academic history, in many ways, is digging itself in deeper and deeper holes. It's becoming more and more sectionalized. It's becoming more fragmented. It is, of course, very heavily colored, as all the arts and humanities subjects are, by woke. No, I'm not optimistic about that. I'm profoundly pessimistic about our universities. I think there's an extremely strong case to be made for closing down every humanities department in Britain. And were I Secretary of State for Education, I would. We're going to need cost-cutting measures. The way I would deal with it, I would say, the way we will restore national health dentistry on the basis of genuine freedom at the point of use is by closing all university humanities departments. The cheer that would go around the country would carry it forward, and it will be well deserved.
Well, have you got a new book coming out anytime soon?
No, the one that I'm working on rather sporadically, and you'll see why from how I responded to some of the questions, is my autobiography. You'll remember there's that wonderful line, and I can't remember which one of the girls it is in The Importance of Being Earnest, when she says she's keeping a diary because you want something sensational to read on the train. Well, that will certainly be my autobiography.
Well, we've got a joint venture next year, haven't we, sort of, where I'm doing a book on kings and queens, one essay on every single monarch since Alfred the Great. And you'll never guess which one David's writing about, Henry VIII. Deadline end of the year, just a reminder. Ladies and gentlemen, David Starkey. And just a reminder, tomorrow we have For the Many Live with Jackie Smith and me on the stage at 1:30 with Jeff Norcott and Rosie Holt. And then at 4:30 it's Jess Phillips. And that's me done for this year's Edinburgh Fringe, which I'm rather sad about. But thank you very much for coming, and thanks to all of you who've come to more than one show, way beyond the call of duty. Thank you very much.
Hello, and thank you for watching David Starkey Talks. If, as I very much hope, you're enjoying them, why not become more actively involved and join my members club? As a member, you'll be able to take part in the members-only weekly question and answer session, suggest topics for forthcoming videos, and have priority booking for my forthcoming live events. And while you're at it, why not have a look at the store page on my website, davidstarkey.com. There you can purchase t-shirts and other merchandise, buy signed copies of my books, and, if you're feeling brave and a bit flush, even arrange to take me out to lunch. Thank you once again for watching. I look forward to hearing from you and to welcoming you to my members club.